What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before I get going with the Premier League season preview, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. As I mentioned, it is Premier League preview day on the Touchline Talk Show. Got the entire show dedicated to looking ahead to this Premier League season that gets underway this weekend. As usual, two parts to the show, followed by the weekend look ahead. So I broke this into the Premier League preview into two sections here. We're going to talk about storylines, and then I've got a superlative section to kind of get a better overview of the entire league and some of the things that I'm looking for. But before we get to all of that, starting with the three storylines, the three key things I'm looking at this season. Of course, the first one here is the title race. And there are a couple parts to this storyline and the way I'm looking at it. First, does Manchester City give anybody a chance to take this from them? As historic as last season ended up being, it cannot be overlooked that it was not a great Premier League campaign from Manchester City. Now, they kicked it into gear and looked incredible at the end of the season. From start to finish, they were the best team in the Premier League. Arsenal just could not hold on for the final, month, 2 months of the season. I guess maybe a little bit longer than that. But don't forget how poorly Manchester City started relative to their own standards. To me, that is a big part of this season with the improvement that you're seeing around Manchester City. How do they follow up winning a treble? Do they come out of the gates and actually give themselves some kind of cushion? Because you're in trouble if you're trying to catch Manchester City. What made last year interesting is that Manchester City was always the team trying to catch Arsenal until they overtook them and it was basically over. Right, once that passing of the baton happened, Arsenal never really put up a fight. So that's the first part. What is the pace Manchester City set? Because last season, it is 100% possible that if they do that again, they're not winning the league. If you look at the teams in previous seasons, the Manchester City teams, the Liverpool teams that have competed for titles, almost without exception, and I haven't actually done the math and went back and looked at it, but they all put up better points totals than Manchester City last season. I would not be shocked at all if somebody outside of City gets to 90 points. The question is that enough? Because the answer for Liverpool in past seasons has been no, right? They've lost out on by a point. So that's the first part is what is the pace that we're talking about here? And then the second part is who actually emerges as potential title contenders if somebody does outside of City? Can Arsenal regroup and go again? They look so good for so long and then it just fell apart. Can somebody else get involved in this title race? Newcastle. That is a better Newcastle team today than it was at the end of last season with the addition of Sandro Tonali and the addition of Harvey Barnes. They had the same amount of losses and the same amount of goals conceded last season as Manchester City. The difference was, I believe it was City had 9 more wins because Newcastle drew everybody. If you just elevate that attack a little bit and you get the same kind of defensive performance, that is a formula for getting into this title race. I'm going to talk about Liverpool more later, but obviously you got to consider Liverpool a title contender until Liverpool give you reason to believe otherwise. And historically, when they've had that bad season, they have bounced back in a very big way. And then you start looking at, can Manchester United get involved? The upgrades at goalkeeper and striker, your two big positions of need. If you get what you're expecting to get out of Rasmus Højlund, you know what you're getting in Andre Onana, that's a much better team than last season as well. And then Chelsea has all kinds of talent. Whether it comes together and they're able to contend for a title this season, not so sure. But it's not like you're just looking at one or two teams that I could talk myself into getting into this title race. Whether they can actually dethrone Manchester City is a different conversation. But that's the second part of this, is who actually gets involved in this title race, who can push Manchester City, and then, of course, that first part I talked about, what is the pace that Manchester City is setting. Second, the European spots in general. And again, I have a couple reasons and a couple things I'm looking at here. First, here is the top half of the Premier League, or half of the Premier League, what I consider to be the top half. But you have half the Premier League that you should be arguing have ambitions of qualifying for Europe next season. Obviously, your top four from last season: City, Arsenal, United, Newcastle. Of course, Liverpool. Brighton, with what they did, are in that conversation now. Aston Villa qualified for Europe last season, so they're automatically in the conversation. Then you got to round out your big six. I'm going to call it a big seven now with Newcastle. Tottenham and Spurs, obviously. It's the expectation every season, especially after missing out last season. And then West Ham, who didn't quite navigate the European adventure Premier League balance very well, but the past few seasons, the core of that team under David Moyes have been a team that has qualified for European spots and, disrupted this big six, big seven. That's half the Premier League. And that's not even talking about somebody like a Brentford or a Fulham. Fulham was in the conversation for those Europa League, Conference League spots some of last season. There are so many teams that have legitimate aspirations of ending up qualifying for Europe, because all 7 big clubs are in a good spot right now, or at least are trying to do something to change the bad position they're in. And then you have the Brightons and the Villas, who were just really good and really consistent last season and finished ahead of the Tottenhams and the Chelseas. So those teams need to be in this conversation too. And I will just always put West Ham in there. And obviously all these teams can't qualify for Europe. Which gets to the second part of this, which is the possibility of this extra Champions League spot when the new system and all the changes start. There is a 5th spot up for grabs. Now, you have to earn that spot through your performance in the European competitions, which is why it's not just guaranteed to the Premier League. But if you go back and look, most seasons, the Premier League has been one of the top 2 leagues in terms of European performance, which would get them this extra Champions League spot. And then obviously you have the knock-on effect from that as well, where 5 teams in the Premier League, so you get an additional team into Europe, hypothetically. But how does the 5 European spots, assuming that happens, change this conversation? Because now you're talking about at least 6 teams that should be expecting to qualify for the Champions League every season. And I'm removing Tottenham from that conversation just because I'm not sure you can argue Spurs should be expecting to qualify for the Champions League. Obviously, that's the goal. But if you want to throw Spurs in, I don't have an issue with that. But even if you keep Spurs out of the equation, you have 6 teams because Newcastle are in that group now. The way that they are spending money, the fact that they have qualified for it this season, that is the bar moving forward. So you have 6 teams, a maximum of 5 spots, which means somebody, City, Arsenal, United, Newcastle, Liverpool, Chelsea, is going to be disappointed at the end of every single season moving forward. And that's before you talk about the possibility of somebody ruining the party. Or Tottenham just being the 5th best team in the Premier League. So there's that aspect of it as well. How does this extra Champions League spot, assuming the Premier League gets one, change this conversation, sort of alter the way people because we're so used to top four and the significance of top four. And now it's more of a top five, but not guaranteed. What does this do for the Aston Villas and Brightons of the world? Potentially opening up another European spot. All of that is part of this storyline for me as well. We're just changing the way that we look at qualifying for Europe and a successful season for the top clubs in the Premier League, because odds are the Premier League is going to get this extra spot when this new qualifying system kicks in here. And so that conversation starts this season. The third storyline: new managers. And I'm going to include Vincent Kompany in this conversation just because I want to talk about him. Vincent Kompany has obviously never managed a Premier League game, and he's just a higher profile figure than your other two managers who are coming up. So, yes, technically he's a little bit different than the other guys in this category, but I'm throwing him in there because there are two specific things I'm really curious with this Burnley team with Vincent Kompany. One, tactically, how does he handle this? For a vast majority of Vincent Kompany's career, player, manager, he has been on teams expecting to compete for and win trophies. He is used to being on the team that is expected to win and managing a team that's expected to win. This is a team trying to avoid relegation. That changes so much in terms of style of play. Or does it? You would have to think, though, that even at just a very basic level, Burnley is not going to have the same kind of possession they had last season. Part of what is so incredible about what Kompany has done is that he completely changed the way Burnley play. He's got them in this Manchester City-esque model. Can debate how close it is, but philosophically, it's about playing, being expansive, being forward-thinking, being on the front foot. Those are not things you associate with teams trying to avoid relegation. Now, Fulham, who scored a bazillion goals in the championship, found a way to balance all of that last season, which was a key to their success. They were good defensively and scored goals, but they didn't have the same style of play, the same free-flowing, breathtaking attack they had in the championship, because it's just not possible. You don't have the talent advantage anymore. So how does Kompany kind of take the tenets of Sean Dyche's Burnley with the direct play, bring that into what he is trying to do, and navigate all of that in a position he is not familiar with, which is trying to battle relegation? And then just second, can this Burnley team do enough to convince Vincent Kompany that this is where he wants to be long term? Because there's always going to be this thought in my mind that if he continues to do a good job, it's not going to be long before somebody goes after him, because he's one of those guys that you knew before he even retired. That right there, built to be a manager. All kinds of leadership, everything you want. He checks all the boxes, and by the way, he's done a phenomenal job so far. Can Burnley hold on to him if he avoids relegation? Is he then looking for the next challenge? All of that goes into the Vincent Kompany part of this storyline for me. Second, obviously you got Mauricio Pochettino at Chelsea. I haven't talked about this too much on video. I've written about it. But Pochettino is in a fascinating spot for me, because that is a Chelsea team that needs somebody that knows how to work with young talent, which is how Pochettino made his name. He is a perfect fit for that squad if you put it in a vacuum. At the same time, that is a squad of some of the most expensive young players in Europe, of guys who are unhappy because of their lack of playing time last season, of guys who expect to be on the field. And while maybe not the highest profile names in Europe anymore, they're not exactly the kind of ragtag, and maybe that's a little bit disrespectful, but they're on a different level from a publicity standpoint than his Tottenham team or his Southampton teams, right? Where Harry Kane kind of comes out of nowhere. Enzo Fernandez is the most expensive player in Premier League history when they bought him. So there is, and also just the politics of it. The fact that this is Chelsea, that this is Todd Boehly, that chaos seems to reign supreme. Sounds kind of familiar to what Pochettino was dealing with at PSG. That didn't go so well. Now again, he doesn't have Neymar, Mbappe, and Messi in his locker room. But there is that politics kind of big picture side of this that Pochettino struggled with at PSG that is involved in this job. If he is allowed to just coach his players, I love this fit. But if it gets more involved than that, and he's trying to put out fires and deal with egos and find common ground with Todd Boehly because Todd Boehly doesn't just let him do his job, I could see this ending poorly. To me, Poch is a guy who has a sweet spot. And he is brilliant when he's in that sweet spot. But what we saw at PSG is that you give him a different kind of challenge. Now, maybe he's learned something about this, or maybe it was just that situation. Which, again, makes this all the more fascinating, that it's kind of a combination of what he excelled at and what he struggled with. What lessons has he learned? Does he still have that magic touch with young players? Can he pull Chelsea out of this spiral they've been on? Then, Ange Postecoglou at Spurs. I know I talked about this when he got hired. To me, this is a home run. Nothing else has worked. I thought Antonio Conte was exactly the manager they needed. Clearly wrong about that. So at this point, I'm just looking for positivity vibes. Get this club going back in the right direction. Get these fans invested again. Have some kind of attacking impetus. Ange Postecoglou gives you all of that. Can he, as you're handling a Harry Kane transfer situation that it's seeming more likely is going to turn into a Harry Kane impending contract expiry situation, can you get people to believe in this team again? What does this look like stylistically? This team has been drilled to play on the counter and play conservatively for so long. Can he kind of get them to undo all of that immediately and become much more entertaining to watch? I 100% buy the logic behind this hire. Just how long does it take it to kind of sink in? Because the other point I made at the beginning, he is not a quick fix guy. He is a long-term progress guy. If you're looking for somebody to get you results in 3-4 months, don't hire Ange Postecoglou. You have to give him time to let him do what he does. Can he rewrite that narrative and find immediate success at Spurs? There are a lot of interesting questions with him as well. Then the other two. Andoni Iraola at Bournemouth, and then the manager he replaced in Gary O'Neill, but I'll talk about Iraola first. Andoni Iraola is, one of the rising young stars of the managerial profession. Very, very good job in Spain. And so now he gets his chance in the Premier League. For Bournemouth, I really do see the argument that if this guy is interested in your job, you got to do what you got to do to get him. You can't be the ones to say no, even if that means parting ways with Gary O'Neill. The aspect of this I'm really intrigued by is that Iraola has made his name overachieving, right? Getting more out of his teams than expected, finishing higher in the table than expected. The kinds of things that Bournemouth should be looking for. Also sounds awfully familiar to what Eddie Howe did with those teams. If this works, Iraola is the kind of guy who can take this team from a relegation candidate to a solid mid-table team that doesn't have to worry about that, just like Eddie Howe did. There is all kinds of upside to this if you are Bournemouth. It's just strange to think about a world in which Bournemouth is able to acquire this kind of manager, but that's the power of the Premier League. There's the other side too, which is goal number one here is to avoid relegation. And what happens if this doesn't go well? Now you have pretty much forced yourself into a position where you've got to fire one of the most promising young managers in the world because you got to do something different to avoid relegation. The combination of the potential and the high stakes makes this really intriguing to me. Because I completely buy Iraola as a manager. I totally get why Bournemouth did this. I would do it too. There's just that downside, which you can't live in that fear and think, what if we get relegated? But the reality is, if you are in the relegation battle, you're probably changing managers. It's just how it works. Will Bournemouth be willing to stick with him even if it starts slowly? That's another interesting part of this. So there's him, and then, as I mentioned, the manager he replaced, Gary O'Neill, is now taking over for Julian Lopetegui at Wolves. Gary O'Neill did a terrific job last season. He deserved to keep that job. I think he was just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time when Iraola became available and interested in Bournemouth. And this Wolves team needs help. I love this idea as well. He came in and stabilized that Bournemouth team. He got them to reach another level. That's what Wolves need too. It's almost a preventative measure here because no, they haven't been in the relegation race in a very serious way. But also the margins for this team are just getting thinner and thinner and thinner every single season. Where they finished in the table is not indicative of where they are in the hierarchy of this league. If you look at the goal difference and those kind of things, they caught an awful lot of breaks last season. So Gary O'Neill's job is to come in there and stabilize this because it is just on a downward trajectory. He absolutely deserves another chance to be right back in the Premier League. I'm glad he got it. So that's the Wolves side of this. Is it just hasn't been good enough. They haven't been good to watch. There just isn't a lot to be excited about. I would not be surprised at all if they get dragged into the relegation race in a big-time way this season. Gary O'Neill has proven he knows how to take a team that looks like a relegation team on paper and elevate it. That's what you're going to need at Wolves based on what's been happening the past couple seasons in the trajectory of the club.